Um, Hi, and it's very nice to see you here. I want to thank Armenian Foundation for this incredible opportunity to talk about Armenian calligraphy. This is quite overwhelming for me because I'm first time in Turkey, and first time in this building. I've been before coming here. I was in Italy, and this summer I was in Washington. And each time, each country was an interesting experience because once you talk to Americans, it's a bit different. You talk to Italians, it's a bit different. And now I'm here. So I want to say a few words about who I am. I'm currently teaching a visual communication course in American University in Yerevan. By training, I'm a painter and a graphic artist, and by profession, I'm a designer. So my work with letters is a natural one. I work with them because they are part of design and they are one of the pillars of design, typography. But calligraphy is something else. Calligraphy is a living letter, is a letter that has a specific requires specific attitude because it's not rigid, it's not a typography. So for me, as an artist, it's a lot more interesting to write by hand than just use a typeface. So I'm here to tell you the story of calligraphy, of Armenian calligraphy, and well, I can't tell you the whole story because I don't know the whole story. I will only share with you what I know. So little to nothing has been written or published about Armenian calligraphy for over a century. This research and these efforts tries to kind of revive a dialogue between this important art form and the general public and art lovers. And I must confess that it's difficult for me to speak impartially about Armenian letters or experience of writing them. I'm getting emotional, and it touches a different string inside of you. So in Armenian there is a word, garot, and those of you who speak Armenian know that word. That word describes a specific feeling. I think no other language has that feeling, and writing these letters helps to kind of fill the void that you have inside. So I was fortunate to be born in a house that the walls of which were covered with works of art, and shelves were filled with the books on philosophy and history. And that house belonged to a specific culture, to certain culture, but was open and cosmopolitan. My dad was a painter, so it was a natural thing that Bruegel and his paintings were sort of art that I was growing up on. And as a child, I was captivated by the wonders of the ancient world, especially the cultures that were in close proximity to Armenia geographically. And here, of course, you see an incredible reliefs from Assyria. So for a kid, you know, you grow up on this and kind of opens a very different channels to your imagination. So history and mythology and archaeology became my primary interests, and were followed by formal training in plastic arts. I went on to study painting and graphics later on, so over 7 years I dedicated to academic studies of painting. So in 1993, my life kind of took an unexpected turn. I was born in Yerevan, in Armenia, but I've left home, and I first went to Israel, and I worked there for many years in a field of graphic design. But I never lost the connection and the sight of my culture. There was always this thing, that this thread that was was never interrupted, even though I was physically far away from home. So I moved to Amsterdam, and years later I came back to Jerusalem with one purpose in mind. I wanted to find literature on Armenian calligraphy. This photo is from Surp Jacob church in Old City, Jerusalem. Incredibly beautiful place. If you've never been, you really should go. It's sort of a spiritual center for us. In 2010, I finally returned to Armenia, after almost 20 years of other, sometimes we call that life, other life. So I was never formally trained as a calligrapher, and so for me, working with letter forms was always an integral part of illustrative process and solving design problems. Here I made this artwork. It's actually my sort of imaginary Mesrop Mashtots, the creator of Armenian alphabet. So I was always drawn to writing, but I knew and I was aware of the fact that I can only rely on my intuition, and discipline, and continuous practice. I never had a teacher, and it's not surprising because this art has been laying dormant for so many years that it's difficult to find someone to help you start with. And hopefully the workshop tomorrow will help some of you to start this process of writing calligraphy. I was looking, because I didn't have any physical help, I didn't have a teacher, so I turned, of course, to manuscripts and book publications to find material that could help me start my work. So it was a book which in 2010 galvanized this process of study, as I received an invitation to contribute to an Armenian section of the World Encyclopedia of Calligraphy, which was set to be published in New York in 2011. I quickly realized that I knew very little about calligraphy as a discipline, and in addition to that, my knowledge of technique of writing was at best very superficial. Nevertheless, it took me almost 8 months of hard work, during which I started to ask myself important questions concerning the tradition and the process of writing by hand. I knew that this was a unique opportunity to present the beauty of our alphabet to a wider audience. It was also a question of prestige, because it's an encyclopedia, a world encyclopedia of calligraphy, and I really wanted us to be presented in that book with honor and dignity. So it was my first publication, and when the book came in mail and I opened it, I was really filled with a sense of pride and for our culture, because I saw it was really well done and well printed. So there are a few disciplines in which the problem of definition is more acute, and calligraphy is one of those fields. There is a lot of prejudice and misunderstanding when it comes to calligraphy. It intrigues and fascinates the collective conscious. So calligraphy, basically, if we try to define it as a term, is the writing, is script in purest form. Its virtues aspire preciseness, beauty, distinctness, simplicity, originality, proportion, and all of that ultimately leads to unity and mastership and freedom. Its practice cultivates qualities such as patience and observation. That's really important. So Plato calls calligraphy a geometry of the soul which manifests itself physically. And in this, calligraphy is closer to painting than writing. This image is from Jerusalem again. There is a beautiful painting there that has this beautiful Armenian writing on the bottom. You could call this calligraphy, and I'll speak about the difference between the miniature painting and calligraphy in a little while. So it would be dangerous to confuse writing and calligraphy. If the former, the writing, makes sense only through readability, the calligraphy's purpose is beyond utility, and it's primarily of a formal and artistic value. The term calligraphy, of course, derives from Greek. These are two words, graphein, which is to write, and kalos, which means beautiful. And in Armenian, the term actually has the same structure, geragrutsun or arvestagrutsun. They follow the same principle. So, beautiful writing isn't, even if it has a distinct style, is not necessarily calligraphy. A number of definite elements must combine together before a true calligraphy can develop. One of those things is availability of tools which allow for a swift movement across an even surface, such as pen and brush together with paper. Calligraphy did not develop wherever the script was incised with the stylus or knife into materials such as palm leaves, like in South or Southeast Asia, or clay bricks, like in Mesopotamia or Crete, or bone, like in early China. Here, of course, you see a cuneiform inscription, an Armenian inscription, actually, of King Gargishti. So even though stone is not the best medium for calligraphy, it's well suited to receive and preserve calligraphic copies. And indeed, Armenian or Western calligraphy can be said to trace its roots to stone inscriptions. Here is a little part of a cross-stone khachkar, we call it in Armenian, from Artsakh, from Qarabakh, that has this kind of elegant but kind of childish writing on it. So here you see an attempt to be a bit less formal in writing. So the second vital factor is motivation and the attitude of society to writing. In the case of Islam, it was revelation and conquest. And in the Far East, it was artistic sensibility and political hegemony. And in Western Europe, both secular and religious legality and stress on letter form and function. Of course, here you see a beautiful example of Dutch calligraphy, as a very elegant interpretation of form. And finally, in the Armenian cultural sphere, it's the preservation of tradition and spiritual illumination. The third element which invariably distinguishes calligraphy from beautiful writing is existence of definite and often mathematically based rules which guide the construction of letters and the relationship between line and space. Here you see an example of Armenian script that I prepare usually when I want to explain to students how to construct the letters. So beautiful writing, on the other hand, is an expression of spontaneous individuality. It's not rooted in generally accepted knowledge and technique, and and it can therefore develop under a variety of circumstances, either because of individual effort or because it's connected with a certain sphere of cultural or religious life of a specific community. And finally, if all the right elements combine, beautiful writing can move toward calligraphy. So calligraphy, to sum it up, it can be defined as harmony between script, tools, text, and cultural heritage. All of that together form the necessary environment for calligraphy to develop. Although contemporary definition of calligraphy goes beyond utility of writing and expands into a form of sophisticated, sometimes abstract art, it is the need for legible written communication which gave birth to calligraphy as a discipline of harmonious and beautiful writing. In contemporary context, it would be loosely associated with typography and lettering. And so when it's practiced, and practice is really, really important, it acquires a renewed dimension, finally becoming what it's never ceased to be, an art. In the Armenian setting, and for sake of creating better terminology, we must make an attempt to draw distinction between calligraphy as art, with primarily a focus on graphic representation of the letter, and miniature painting. That's important. We need to draw the line between those two, because miniature painting is more focused on beautifying the letter, and you're very familiar with that probably, while calligraphy focuses on the plasticity of the letter shape. So for Armenians, writing has never been an alien practice. In the shadow of the Noah's Peak, remnants of 5,000-year-old culture stand witness to one of the oldest human settlements on the planet. I don't know who's the author of this photograph. It's actually mind-blowingly beautiful. It's from Van, and all of you have a chance to actually visit Akhtamar. If there was ever a paradise, I'm sure it looked like this. So from millennia-old archaic signs to medieval Christian manuscripts written with the use of sophisticated alphabet, Armenian letters remain a mystery. Actually, the signs that you see here are over 10,000 years old. Some of them look like letters, many of them look more like logos, more like a combination of different shapes, but one thing is certain, they're incredibly old. So when Armenian king Varam Shapur officially sanctioned the Armenian alphabet created by Mesrop, he consciously supported the adoption of writing system that resembled no neighboring one. And the new alphabet was fashioned of glyphs that looked significantly different. But there is more to this occasion. Mashtot's task was by all means act of destiny and fate, and as it shaped the future of the entire nation. Thus, from the 5th century on, the Armenian alphabet was a sign by which Armenians as a group were distinguishable from other Christians in the area, especially the dominant group, the Greek Orthodox, whose language, like Armenian, is Indo-European. So the adoption of the Mesropian script began a period of illumination unparalleled in Armenian history, and the intellectual expression. Its graceful letters reflect the enormous artistic potential Armenians became to realize in the following turbulent centuries, producing an unprecedented amount of architectural gems and illuminated manuscripts and applied arts. This is interesting because every time I speak about this, I give an example of architecture, because the achievement of Armenian architects to me is more valuable than the achievement of Western architecture, because if English and French would be at war, they would never destroy buildings. They would probably kill each other for some strange reasons, but they would never touch the cultural heritage. Well, Armenians had to create in the circumstances of complete destruction. Every time there was a wave coming from Central Asia of Mongols or Tatars, they would completely destroy everything on their path. And Armenians had to build and rebuild over and over again. So Armenian architecture in that sense is unique because it created this incredible value in impossible circumstances. So illuminated manuscripts, which were, if not invented by Armenians, then at least pioneered by them, show a highly developed culture of writing. The remarkable aesthetic value of miniature painting has made the subject of much acclaim and study. Armenian alphabet became the tool to write down the masterpieces of philosophy and poetry. They code and decipher medical, mathematical, and alchemical knowledge the nation passed from the dawn of time. It's interesting that I'm not sure if you know that, but Armenian has over 20 different ways to code information. We use over 20 different ways to lock information through a code, and if you have the key, you can decode it. A lot of this, we call this Gartnagir, because it's secret writing. Usually it was medical in content, because when you create a recipe for medicine, you must make sure that it's executed exactly as it's intended to, otherwise it might kill someone if you prepare it incorrectly. So they would code the recipe so nobody could alter anything in it. And if you have the key, you can decode it and you can prepare the medicine, and it would be a cure, not a killer. So we would talk a bit about the Armenian script classification. So Armenian script styles are neither neat or nor clean cut, and the use of the one type with another is common. Those of you who have seen Armenian manuscripts always notice that there are different letter types used together. It's never just one style of writing. So Yerkatagir, this would be the oldest one. It's monumental in style. It's majuscule, so that means it's only capital letters. There are no lowercase. And the letters are large and very erect, and they're gracefully rounded lines that connect the elements of the letter. So all the letters, all the script of Yerkatagir is written between two imaginary lines, and they actually fit between those two, with exception of a few letters which elements extend and leave the boundaries of these two imaginary lines. And Bolorgir is a script which developed elegant and graphic forms. And although its name suggests a round script, the characters are usually slanted, and letters appear to have sharp corners. You can here see an example of Bolorgir. It became the base for contemporary print type for the books. When we use this type. And Shekhagir is a cursive script. It's rarely seen in any manuscripts, and it's used mainly for notes. It was executed with different material, with different pens. In general, the shape of the letters recall that of irregular Bolorgir, although some elements of Yerkatagir are present as well. Now, it's important to say something about this because usually we are told that the Armenian scripts developed in a very linear way. That is, Yerkatagir was first, then came Bolorgir, then came Notergir, and the last one Shahagir, which is the script writing. But that theory makes no sense, at least to me. And I'll explain why. Because at the time when Armenian alphabet was created, and that's 5th century, Armenia was split between Byzantium and Persia. So it was in a very difficult historical circumstances. And the first and the most important thing for Armenians was to be able to write to each other, to communicate through writing. Yerkatagir, and that's the script that I showed you before, is impossible to write for a letter. So Mashtots, being very educated, being a scientist, would travel all over Asia. He would come to Alexandria. He was in Egypt as well. After all that research, to create a letter which was impossible to use if you want to write a letter to another person actually makes little sense to me. The problem is that we don't have any evidence. There is nothing that we can show to prove that Armenian letters, different styles, were already present at the 5th century. But it's interesting to say that Shahagir, for example, is present when it's usually said that it only developed in 17th, 18th century. There are 2 manuscripts in Matenadaran that belong to 10th century and have Shahagir in them. So only 2 manuscripts can already prove that we use these letters way, way before, even actually 700 years before the 18th and 19th century. There was another story which is related to the only example of Armenian written on papyrus, which we don't have another example. It's in Bibliothèque Française in Paris. And that also proves that this linear evolution of Armenian alphabet is far from truth, because the letter types used on that papyrus actually were thought to be used 500 years later. But on historical grounds, that papyrus belongs to 6th, 7th century, and it's using letters that were used, at least we thought were used much, much later. So Notargir, the script that you see here, was a blend of Bolorgir and Shahagir, and it was used between 17th and 18th centuries. Actually, the name suggests its origin, Notargir. It's kind of notarius writing, and it belonged to the royal court of Armenian Catholicos, that actually the patriarch of Armenian, and it could enter the Armenian probably from Latin, because notarius is a Latin word, so Notargir is probably Latin in origin. So letters we are surrounded by them. They are all over the place, and they are in the inscriptions that we live in stone, and they are on our coins. They were on our coins and still are. We carve them on wood. We use them on ceramics. And to me, abandoning the individual qualities of a handwritten text would equal to whitewashing, so to speak, of our memory, both on individual and collective levels. We engraved the letters on metals, and in combination with unique Armenian notation, they were used down to write down music. We applied them for mathematical and astronomical calculations. Here you can see a piece from Shirakatsi's astronomical manuscript. So writing was, and thankfully still is, a part of every living culture. Even today, when we receive a handwritten letter, something happy and familiar occurs, as if for a second we can feel the presence of a friend, a lover, or a long-missed parent. So everything written by hand, it becomes explicitly unique. And we used to know how to do this well. Here you can see a little clip from the birth certificate of my grandmother. She was born in Shushi in Artsakh, and you can see it's written in 2 languages, in Russian and Armenian, and it's a beautiful handwriting. So something happened, some change happened in a way that we deal with the handwritten text, and it demoted the art of writing to just a simplified way to record information. So we should make an effort to try to preserve this tradition of writing by hand, because it's expressing who we are. Every person's handwriting belongs only to you. And there is an intimate relationship between picture and script. I want to tell you a bit about how calligraphy is treated in 3 great traditions of calligraphy. So in some cases you can really see the pictorial origin of the writing, like in case of Egyptian hieroglyphs or early Sumerian writing. But here you can see, for example, in Chinese, the pictorial origin is clearly visible in this script. So a letter of the alphabet may not be a picture in the sense of representing a known object, but it's still a visual sign. A representation is not an essential element of visual art, and for an abstract painting is no less a painting or less valuable than a representative one. Eastern visual culture has a deep understanding of the role of empty space in the image, and Chinese and Japanese painters have admirable courage to leave empty large parts of their picture surface. It's interesting because also when we talk about typography, I always tell my students that the negative space is as valuable and as important as the positive space. That is, it's the air around the letter. And Chinese give a perfect example of doing that. They're always very sensitive to how much air you leave around writing or drawing. So it's incredible if you want to look at that, those examples, especially in Japanese calligraphy. They create this very dynamic feeling of negative and positive space. By that they create a relationship, and they make sure that your eye follows a certain path when you look at an image. So in calligraphy the pictorial element remains a dominant position, and in Far East the writer and the painter usually are considered to be the same person, or more or less identical. So if writing informs us about content in a verbal matter, calligraphy communicates something beyond the mere verbal. Actually, in this painting, it's actually painted by a Chinese emperor. So can you imagine if a king can paint like that? Then that's probably says something about the nation. So if we speak about Arabic, the outsiders often speak of the abstract beauty of Arabic calligraphy, but from Islamic point of view, calligraphy has nothing to do with art of abstraction. It's at the very center of a spiritual and political life of the people. And of course you know that Islam forbade depiction, and all the creative energy went to writing in turn. So in the Quran, the word of Allah is revealed through an Arab language written down in Arabic characters. So calligraphy is a part of a sacred bureaucracy designed to impress on society political order based on the Quran. Yet by drawing out the lines of the Arabic letter in Kufic, as in this example, is to make them move across the page in a relentless pursuit of ultimate truth. The calligrapher kind of appeals to a deeper level of consciousness. And the basic for Western calligraphy is, of course, a Latin or Roman alphabet, which appeared at for the first time in Italy in the inscriptions dating from 7th or 6th centuries BC. And when you look at these letters, they are so clear. I was, before coming, like I said, to Istanbul, I was in Italy, and I could see the Latin letters on almost every building. And compared to other, they are so legible, they are so clear. This alphabet is just as if it's designed to be understood. So, of course, it's not without a base, because the Roman society was highly literate, and excavations in Rome show library rooms in most houses. There were at least 26 public libraries in Rome alone. That already says a lot about the society. So an important element in Western calligraphy is connection between form and function. And broadly speaking, the letters are used for the copying of literature, aimed at clarity before everything, regularity for documenting information. Here, of course, you can see an example which is goes beyond just pure legibility. It makes an attempt, quite successful attempt, to be beautiful. So usually at the hands of professional scribes, this deliberate stylization can give the letters element of very imposing beauty, as in this Gothic writing. So it's important to understand that when we write, the idea is to remove the pen from the surface as little as possible. So you write quickly, and by that you fuse one letter with another. That gives birth to many ligatures, as you can see in this picture. A lot of letters are fused together, and that happens because it's written quickly. So I will show you a little bit of the visual material that I managed to find so far with relation to Armenian calligraphy. And it's interesting that the geography is very wide. From Moscow to Constantinople, to Istanbul, to Tiflis, so all over the place. But we don't know if such books were published in Far East or Western America. I'm not so sure about that. So the earliest one that I found was published by Lazarean Institute in Moscow. It was established in 1815 by Lazarean family, who moved from Persia to Moscow, and that institute taught different languages, including Armenian, Persian, Arabic, and Turkish. This family was important. They were important in Persia, and they were especially in the New Julfa. They kind of were a significant family, so they settled in Russia, and they contributed greatly to the intellectual development of the cultural life of the country. So it's very large, it's beautifully printed, and it's very rare because we only have one copy in Armenia, the only one. The second book was published by Ambrosius Galfayan, who actually I was very surprised, because when I saw it, I saw that it's signed strangely by Guy Bey de Lusignan. And when I saw Lusignan, I was, okay, of course, Lusignan is the French-Armenian king dynasty in Kilikia, so this guy obviously thinks he was the descendant of the Armenian kings of Kilikia. So I'm not sure whether he really, there are some opinions that there were different people who claim to be descendants of the Lusignan family, but what Ambrosius did was very important, because he contributed a lot to Armenian culture, and he was educated, like most Armenian intellectuals, in Mechitarist College in Venice. Actually, his brother helped to establish the Mechitarist College in Venice. So he was very gifted, especially with linguistics, and in 1855 he was appointed as a prefect of studies in the Armenian College Murat Samuel in Paris. And later he founded, in 1856, he founded the Armenian National College in Paris. So it's a very tiny book. It's strange, but it's very, very small. But it's really beautiful, and it surprises with this virtuosity of execution. It's without a doubt on the same level as other publications in German, French, or Italian presses. And it won an awards at the Exposition Universelle that was held in Champs-Élysées in Paris in 1855. This book is from Tiflis, and it's kind of somewhat frivolously written, but it displays nevertheless a refreshing approach. The writer is not as skillful in calligraphy as his Venetian publishers or Viennese publishers, and he follows the same approach to composition and letter formation as the Mechitarists. So major writing styles are represented in the book, and here you can see an example of a cursive script, which I mentioned before, Shechagir. So Vienna and Venice, being the two major centers of the Armenian studies, they appear to be responsible for most publications of Armenian calligraphy, but Constantinople is no exception. I'm yet to find the books that were printed here, but the majority was printed in Vienna and Venice. It's worth noting that the calligraphic styles presented in this and other calligraphy books are influenced by letters that were used in Europe at that time. Some of the scripts seem to replicate the same style in different alphabets, and it's not surprising because for them it was important that Armenian would look naturally beautiful next to different alphabets. So if you would use Armenian and Italian next to one another, you would not have a disconnection, a visual conflict between the two alphabets. So they made sure that the Armenian letters looked in style similar to European letters used at the time. So it's not because Armenian engravers did not have imagination or lack of talent. It was a conscious choice on their part. So this book, this little book, is without doubt is one of the most impressive publications, both in general aesthetics and of the letters and the skillful level of engraving. So most authors apparently copied each other's work, or they used the same sources. So it was a common practice. Not every book is original in its contents or unique. So it was interestingly in Venice in 1834 that this book was published, and it was the only one that I found so far that had a written preface, which was written in classical Armenian, and I asked a friend of mine to translate that text because I couldn't understand it. And it's interesting what actually the writer says. He laments the lack of professionals who are engaged in preparation of the new typographic forms. I quote him, "Till today, there have been few within our nation with proper calligraphic knowledge. However, many aspire to acquire it, having no one for a guide or a teacher. As a result, we day by day come across new scripts that are born not in accordance with rules and proportion, and the harmony and the beauty of these." And that's 1834 in Venice. And I could repeat his words one to one today. We still have the same problem. So, speaking of necessity and importance of canons, the rules to achieve purity in writing, the author provides examples of 4 major different scripts, and the ones that I showed before. There are total 27 plates with samples of Notergir, Yerkatagir, and also includes Persian, Greek, and Arabic, and Russian as well. And like most writing books of the same period, it also shows you how to make, space, and join letters, and as well as to choose paper and cut the quills for writing. Here you can see the manual how to prepare the materials. And interestingly, from 1900 onward, we no longer see the level of precision and in execution and refined artistry as that of pre-industrial age. So basically, once the world becomes industrialized, trains and cars replace horses, the level of engraving and the level of execution in letter styles significantly goes down. So these copybooks were quite popular and there were many printed, but today very few survive, so that only makes them more precious for us. There are not many copies. I searched for them everywhere I go and I only find few. So they are really remarkable from artistic point of view. And it would be fair and just to say that this tradition was interrupted as a consequence of the genocide which Armenian nation went through in 1915, and it's important to understand that at the same time Europe was going through a very important development in design. Bauhaus school was established in Weimar, in Germany, the most important and the most significant school of the 20th century, but Armenian tradition was interrupted in 1915. So these developments in typography and art never reached us. We never had a chance to implement those understandings in design in our own frameworks. So these problems with the textual communication for the past 30 years also start to spill into the digital world, because we are more and more moving toward that. So if the genocide nearly exterminated the Armenian intellectual elite, the 1917 Russian Revolution also brought the end to the classical education that was interrupted and was no more in the newly established Armenian Republic. And since Armenia gained independence, our letter culture have suffered a massive abuse, and forced Latinization was exerted to every domain where textual content was presented. So Soviet reforms ended into splitting the language into 2 orthographic systems. So rhetoric, the art of speaking, was discarded from the curriculum as an anachronism. Nobody really needed it anymore. And same happened to calligraphy. So that again proves that the art of spoken word is connected to the art of writing. These are both very, very closely linked. And the problems that today we have with contemporary Armenian typesets are directly connected to the broken link of tradition. And as a consequence, they pushed for the further decline in our visual culture. So here you have an example of a book that uses the beautiful and proper Armenian typography. And you can see that different letter shapes and different styles of letters are used together on the same surface and creates very beautiful layout. So we are more and more convinced that the urgent need of the revival of these lost traditions is pressing. as ever before. So it's time to consider the reintroduction of those unjustly forgotten letter forms, bringing back the best practices of the Mechitarists. And we need to and must learn from their experience and transmit it to the next generation of students. So in 2017, I led a calligraphy workshop at Tsumo in Yerevan, and during that workshop, a young kids created a unique calligraphic map of Greater Armenia. So it's written Metz Hike here, and this gave them a chance to document our cultural heritage. It was not the only aim of that workshop. Most of all, I wanted to give them a chance to work with Armenian letters, which I must say they have done with most intelligently and with much affection. They really loved it. It was an incredible experience for them to actually experiment with Armenian letters. So this experiment proved that the passion toward our letters can inspire the new generation to heal the torn thread of tradition. A progressive new study needs to be developed for the reintroduction of calligraphy into the school system in Armenia and diaspora, and the latter in particular being under a threat of cultural and linguistic assimilation. A language, and by extension letters, is the foundation of our culture. And preserving the traditions of writing and developing it further, making it more relevant, more appealing to the young generation, but doing it intelligently and with care, will help us to sustain our identity. I believe that at some point we can create the conditions for the return to classical Armenian orthography, which will certainly reignite the fire of intellectual progress and excellence in literature, in poetry, and visual arts. I truly believe that if we would still use classical Armenian, would be much better off today. Unfortunately, in Armenia, we're using a modified language, a modified orthography, and that does not benefit us at all. So I'm going to show you how to write tune in Armenian. So tomorrow we're going to have a workshop. You are most of all most welcome to come and join us. I'm going to try to show you how it's done, and maybe that can give you a little bit of spark to try it on your own. It's going to be new to you because you probably have never done this before. It's not that easy to start with, but believe me that once you get the taste of it, you won't be able to stop. So thank you very much for coming.